Okay, hello, Ling 201. This is going to be our first lecture for the semester. I'm just going to try to walk you through the basics of linguistics because a lot of students who come into this class don't really have much of an idea of what linguistics is. If that applies to you, that's okay. That's why we're here. And normally I'd say, or I'd be happy to say, just ask questions whenever because we're here to learn, and it's easier for me to know what you don't know if you ask questions about things you don't know. It's a little awkward given the current circumstances, though. So if you do have questions, you're welcome to send them to me by email, or I'm going to post these to YouTube. You can just put comments on YouTube, whatever. But ask and let me know, like I said, what you don't know. And then hopefully we can all learn more that way. Before I get into today's lecture, I'm going to point out that there's usually or almost always a quick write associated with each lecture. And since this is the lecture for the first day of class, the first quick write doesn't have much to do about linguistics. It's more about you, so we can kind of get a chance to know each other a little bit. So this one is labeled as the class census. And again, walked through this when I was going through the course outline, but I'm recording these lectures in the summer. It's still July, so I don't know exactly what shape the class will look like by the time we get to September. One of my goals is to try to get these quick writes up online so you can just fill them out there. But if that doesn't work, you're welcome to just fill this out in this. Well, it's originally a Word document. This is the PDF version, but you can send those to me on the drop boxes on D2L. But yeah, just let me know the answers to these questions because I have questions for you too. And like I said, hopefully I'll get to know a little bit about you and where you're coming from by reading those answers. Okay, now I have to answer the big question for you guys, which is, what is linguistics? What exactly are we doing here? In case you didn't know, or in case I didn't say explicitly, my name is Steve Winters. I'm happy to meet you. I hope we all get a lot out of this. I am, I guess I can say, originally from the United States. I've been here in Canada and Calgary since 2007, so it's kind of become home since then. But that also kind of feeds into a little bit of my perspective about sort of the varieties of language we're going to be studying here. I focus specifically on phonetics, which is the study of speech sounds in language. And in particular, I often look at the perception of speech. I'll say more about that as we go. In general, though, I love linguistics. So what is that when I'm talking about it? So linguistics is the scientific study of language. So what does that mean? Science, going back to the language where it came from, which is actually Latin, originally in Latin, sciens meant having knowledge. So in English, science is just kind of a fancy word for knowledge. Excuse me. So again, a question I have for you guys, and it's the first question I like to ask in this class, is what do we know about language? And this is unfortunately where this format is going to be a bit awkward because I do like to ask this question first thing, first day of the semester for this class. And I often get a wide variety of really interesting answers. You all know something about language, even if you haven't taken a linguistics class or have any idea what linguistics is. So this is also an opportunity for you to just let me know what you know about language. We're going to approach it in the topic in a specific way. We're going to look at language scientifically. That doesn't quite cover all the bases, but that's going to be our focus for this semester. So if I leave anything out, I'm still happy to know about what you know about language, which I might not have mentioned explicitly in this lecture or this class. So when we do approach language scientifically, excuse me, what have we learned? So we know, this might not be immediately obvious, but language is biological. So there is a component to language such that we find it in human beings, and generally speaking, we do not find it in any other species on Earth that we know of, at least not in exactly the same way. So language is a unique part of what it means to be human. Some people think it's kind of what makes us human. That might be going a little too far, but it's definitely something human beings have that other animals and other species on Earth do not. So there's got to be a biological component to it somehow. We know that's kind of part of our human nature. So every child that grows up will acquire language unless something kind of really bad happens to that child and they live in sort of a deprived environment. They will just acquire the language that's being spoken in the world around them as they grow up. Every human society that exists in the world uses language for communication. Normally, we think about language as basically a communication tool. It can do more than that, but that's kind of its primary function in our lives, is to be able to communicate thoughts from one person to the next. And every human society does it or uses it for that reason. More sort of abstractly, all languages share certain features in common. And there are certain features not found in any language. To give you a really basic example, when we study languages throughout the world, linguists really haven't gotten around to every single language to figure out exactly how they all work. But every single one that we've seen so far has nouns and verbs, like noun words like language, and verbs like is and acquire, so on and so forth. Every language has those elements in there somewhere. To give you an example of what a language does not have, say you can make a statement like language is uniquely human. And if you want to create a question out of that statement, you can do something interesting. You can sort of invert the order of the noun and the verb which begin the sentence. You can say, is language uniquely human? That's one way to do it, the way we do it in English. Other languages might do it differently. We'll find that out when we start studying syntax. But what we have never encountered in any language in the world is a language which inverts the order of every single word in the sentence. So there's no language in the world where you can say language is uniquely human as a statement, and then to turn it into a question you say human uniquely is language. That doesn't work. Why doesn't that work? It's part of how language is structured, and since it's part of how language is structured, it's kind of part of what we are as human beings. It's because when we're studying language, we're studying the human faculty for language. We're studying kind of an essential part of humanity in doing that. Also, language forms a part of your brain. This is another part of its biological sort of origins, that there are specific parts of your brain which are dedicated to functions like speech production and speech comprehension. And if those parts of your brain get damaged, then you lose a lot of the ability to use language. You can lose the ability to speak if a certain part of your brain gets damaged through some sort of trauma or through a stroke, something like that. And you can lose the ability to understand speech as well, which is not a fun thing to think about. But it's there biologically because it's so important. Your brain kind of has to have those centers in order for you to be able to work as a human being. So even though there are rare cases where you can lose it, in every human case, people have those abilities, which is great. Because there's so much language can do for us, and it's also fun because it's so complex. There's a lot of sort of structural meat in there for linguists to get into and study and kind of be amazed at the wonders of their complexity. So every language has a system of rules for constructing syllables, words, and sentences, which we call the grammar of that language. And we're going to kind of walk through these systems of rules systematically as we go through the semester, looking at each of the different levels of structure as we kind of work our way up from the basic sounds to the structures of sentences and whole conversations. But those structures or those rules are called the grammar of the language. And when you know a language, when you know how to speak it, that means you know what these rules are. But the funny part of this is that knowledge is mostly subconscious. So you don't really know what you know when you know a language. You can't articulate it explicitly. That's not how language works. It's one of the possibilities that language gives us, that we can kind of use language eventually to figure out how those rules work and how to express that. But that's basically what we're going to learn the fundamentals of in this class, is to learn how to express what shape our knowledge of language takes. It's a little complicated, but we're going to make the subconscious knowledge of language in our minds conscious so that we can talk about it. Linguists, therefore, our job in the world, as obscure or arcane as it might be, is to try to figure out what these rules are. And this, while might not be immediately practical, does have sort of practical effects as we get greater and greater knowledge of how these systems work. Because at this point, these various systems exist now, which didn't exist when I was a kid, when I first got interested in linguistics. So we have talking machines, and we have machines we can talk to, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different applications of linguistics that you might not have thought about. But so I guess I would say language is everywhere in our lives. It's everywhere in our minds and in almost every single conscious thought that we have, or waking thought that we have. So it's kind of so fundamental to us, we kind of don't really think of it as something separate from us. But once you get into the details of how it works, you can start to see what sort of massive implications our knowledge of it might have. And we're just kind of getting started on that in terms of converting it into something applied, because it really is so complex and it's hard to sort of recreate what human beings do naturally in a machine or some other system external to us. So I'll give you some examples of this subconscious knowledge after that little digression. So here are some possible English words. So we call these nonsense words when we're studying them in linguistics. And they're just words. These are most of them are one syllable word long. One or two of them there's more than one syllable. But words like plab or forch or beeg, shump, stas, hibberd, krong, trab. None of these words mean anything, at least as far as I know. And they could mean something. You could, create a name for somebody like, oh, there's Stas Krong, right? He's a good guy. But you probably don't know anybody with that name. These are just, like I said, nonsense. They could be words, but they're not. Then there's another set of unpossible English words, which we're using sort of the same alphabet for, but when we put the sounds in these orders, then all of a sudden these don't sound like something you could actually say in English. So fmort, ksik, armak, hmsal, flash, spin, notch, ptud, so on and so forth. You can't actually say these in English. So these are sort of Englishy. They could be Englishy, but these could not be Englishy. And why is that? Like, why are these guys okay? And why are these guys not okay, even though none of these actually exist? You've never encountered these guys before in your life, I'm pretty sure. Why are you okay with these guys, but not okay with these guys? There are rules in your head which kind of make some options possible and other options not possible. And this works at the level of sentences as well. It might be a little bit easier to see here because we're more used to kind of moving words around in a sentence, and that's kind of the unit that is most applicable here. But I could ask you a question like, who do you think Tom is shouting at? Or I could express that slightly differently and say, who do you think that Tom is shouting at? I think most of us would find both of these okay ways to express these questions. Or who do you think is shouting at Harry? But I don't think you would ever be okay with this sentence. Who do you think that is shouting at Harry? Which is weird because this looks very similar to kind of the way we're structuring these sentences. Who do you think Tom is shouting at? Who do you think that is shouting at Harry? Somehow this one's just a little bit weird. And it doesn't totally work. It's hard to kind of compute this, even though it can kind of guess what it might mean. But if it's weird for us in the domain of what is called syntax, which is the study of how sentences are put together, then we put a little asterisk in front of it or a star to say, well, this is bad. This is not acceptable. It doesn't work according to the rules of our grammar. But why is that? Okay, the way we're going to figure out what's okay and what's not okay in language, the way we're going to figure out what people can actually do versus what they cannot do, is to, number one, be observant. This is part of the scientific method right at its core, really. So like I said, language is all around us and people use it all the time. It's so kind of fundamental to everything we do. We hardly ever think about it sort of like as an object of observation that would be distinct from us, but you can if you just kind of stop and kind of get conscious about what you're doing. And that's kind of another one of the tools we're going to develop in this class. So language is all around you. It might help, like if you're having a conversation with somebody at a party or just talking to your family or friends or whatever, to kind of stop and listen to like, what are they saying and how are they saying it? Linguists do this all the time at parties. it's maybe why linguist parties are not that much fun, because we pay more attention to how people are saying things rather than what they're saying. But we get sort of meta fun out of that, I guess you could say. Number two, you need to have an open mind when you're doing this. So all languages, it turns out, are equally complex, and all languages are systematic, which is to say they're rule-based. They all have a grammar of some sort that defines how they function. So yeah, this is something we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through this, but it's easy as just sort of a natural human language user to maybe be biased for or against specific kinds of languages for whatever reason, for maybe social or historical reasons. But from the scientific point of view, biases about what languages are better or worse than others are just not valid, because when we look at how they actually work, it turns out they all have structure, they all have complexity, which is fascinating, and which any speaker of that language has to know in order to be able to be a knowledgeable user of that language. So with that in mind, I'm also going to say that linguistics is not about learning how to speak the right way. So a lot of students in this intro class are kind of interested in learning this sort of thing, like, what's the proper or correct grammatical expression in English for a variety of different reasons. And yeah, I'm not going to totally poo-poo that, because, employers are out there or whoever might have certain expectations about the way you talk or what sort of grammar you might use in your writing. And if you want to talk about that stuff offline, I could tell you what I remember from my high school English class, but that's about it. Instead of telling you or teaching you about what certain people think you should say or how you should express yourself in language, as a linguist, we're just going to talk about what people actually do when they use language, not what they should be doing. And it turns out that's just as fascinating, but kind of leads you down a different path in life, which is the scientific one, I guess is the easiest way to say that. So rather than thinking about what people should do or what you might have been taught in your English class, I'm going to ask you to look for generalizations. And the reason we're looking for generalizations in language is because finding out the general truths about language is the way we figure out what the rules of language are. So like I said, what you know about language is not something you were taught in English class or whatever. You learn language, you pick it up from the people who are around you as you grow up, primarily your parents and your other family members and sometimes your friends as well. And you figure out those rules on your own, as this is what every single human being does, and it's an amazing thing that human beings do without having to find out what the rules are exactly. So to find out what people figure out, we have to kind of think about language in a different sort of objective way and sort of focus on what the general patterns are when people actually use language. Okay, what we find out as well when we look at language in this way is that language is creative, which is really cool because it enables you to say and think things that you have never heard before. So I've got a little collection here of things that, or at least one time, were new to me. I kind of have to update this list each year because expressions come and go in the English language, and so sometimes people start saying a new thing and it sounds cool for a while and then it stops being cool. But kind of the main point here is that at any moment in time, you can be creative with language and say something new. It might catch on, but you can use language in a new way to sort of express either similar thoughts to what you've had before or an entire new expression, basically. So an expression that I have encountered relatively recently is the verb stan. So you can say, I think I saw this when I was watching like the Little League World Series at some point a few years ago, and there's some player from like New Jersey whose name was Big Al. And the announcer said, "We stand Big Al," and that just, I could not compute that for a while, and I had to look up on the internet what stand meant as a verb. Apparently it comes from an Eminem song, and that's about all I'll say about it. But what it means is that they're a big fan of Big Al, basically, which is fine. I once got a comment in the teaching reviews for this class that said, his Facebook picture makes me lulz. So I didn't know what that meant either. Lulz is sort of I guess a funny way to say laugh out loud. And I don't know if people still use this, but still makes me lulz. I'm going to re-message him. Okay, so you may not have heard this verb a whole lot before, but it's there. You can use it if you want to. Believe it or not, when I first started teaching this class for my last semester of this class, way back in January of this year, I had never in my life heard the term social distancing. I think we've all heard this a million times by now, though. So that's another sort of made-up expression, which now has a lot of meaning in our lives. Ghosting is kind of a funny one. So ghost, when I was growing up, it was just a noun. It was a spectral thing, the spirit of a dead person or something. And now you can use it as a verb in case you don't want to talk to your ex anymore or something like that. That's sick is kind of a funny one. This maybe is a bit of an older sort of change in expression, but that sick used to mean you were sick with something like the coronavirus or something. Now you can use it as like, oh wow, that's an incredible like basketball move or something, right? That's sick. So people are creative with language all the time, which is maybe its coolest property. But one of the things that implies is that language is not just learned from the environment. I'll put that in a slightly different way. So as I go through this entire semester of lectures, I'm going to say a number of things, a large number of things, quite frankly. I'm going to just give them to you in 50-minute chunks. But during each 50-minute chunk, there's probably going to be a fair number of sentences, a lot of sentences, quite frankly, which you have never heard before in your life. And they don't need to use sort of creative little expressions like lulls or ghosting or whatever. They can just be things I'm saying using words that you're used to hearing, but you've never heard them in that particular order before. The thing is that you can still figure out what I'm saying. You can still understand what I mean, even though you're encountering new sentences that you've never heard before. Language gives you the ability to create new expressions and to understand people who are saying new creative things. So it can kind of constantly keep evolving in that fashion, which is really amazing when you stop to think about it. There's not like some preset, limited set of messages or codes that you can transmit from one person to another. We can all constantly be combining words and sentences into new ways to create sort of new linguistic realities. And another implication of this is that if we're not just getting language from our environment, it's got to be partly innate. There's got to be something in our heads which is able to kind of figure out more general patterns than just the specific sentences and sounds that we hear as we acquire language. So there's something going on in our brains. We know there's little parts of our brains that are devoted to language, and they need input from the environment to work, but they're always going to be there. This is part of who you are, just from your biological core. That being said, language is also social. I think, as we all know, one of the main things you do when you get together with other people is you talk, right? You use language to talk to each other, to communicate. And part of language's social element is that language is arbitrary. So it can sort of randomly differ from, or languages can randomly differ from each other in terms of like what expression you use from one language to the other without any sort of pattern or general region. I've got little stuffed animals here. My child is actually stuck in another country where they don't speak English. And that's part of the reason why I'm recording these videos now before she comes home and chaos returns. But to entertain her when we're talking on Skype, I have some stuffed animals like this one. This is actually the Soviet version of the animated cartoon bear Winnie the Pooh. In Russian, he's called Vinny Pooh. That's a bit random there. In English, we call this creature a bear. In Ukrainian, which is the language my wife speaks, this is called a vedmid. So a bear, vedmid, whatever, that's just a random choice that those two languages have made to talk about something that looks like this. Well, this is a stuffed version of the real thing, but you can call it whatever in any particular language as long as everybody kind of gets on board to say, well, we're going to call it a bear or a vedmid, so on and so forth. There's a little story I can tell you about bears in a bit, but I'll skip it for now. Every language is going to vary according to region, speaker identity, and situation. So even in the English-speaking world by itself, you get variety. So I come from the Midwestern United States. I come from Minnesota. Actually, I'll give you an example of this. It's prop day in Linguistics 201. So this is, well, nominally it's a Coca-Cola, right? Where I come from in Minnesota, this is called a pop in general, a sugary carbonated drink. In a lot of the United States, mostly on the coast, on the west and east coast, and various parts in between, this is called the soda. If you go down to the south in the southern United States, like Georgia, where this drink originally came from, these kinds of drinks are called Cokes in general. So you can have, I'll get you another example. This is a Coke. It's also a 7-Up. So this is a Coca-Cola Coke, and this is a 7-Up Coke. People differ according to regions in how they express things. That doesn't happen for all words, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be speakers of the same language. This can also differ according to just speaker identity. You might say things in a particular way, which other people do not say the same way, or situation. So we use sort of more formal ways of expressing ourselves in formal situations, and less formal ways of expressing ourselves when we're just among friends or chilling out, that sort of thing. All right, language can define communities for that reason. So I can maybe be proud of a Midwesterner as a Midwesterner and say, yeah, this is a Coke, right? I might be proud of being American, however foolish that might be. And I may say, I'm going to spell color without a U, and I'm going to spell it C-O-L-O-R. And you can be Canadian and spell it with the U if you want to, but this is part of what defines me as an American in whatever tiny, small way, right? That can kind of unify people as well as kind of split people apart. It can shape your identity for that reason, right? Who you are, or what you speak, what language you speak can become who you are, part of who you are. Every language undergoes change. I talked about how it can be creative and how that means it's going to be evolving over time as we're constantly creating new forms and understanding new forms of the language. And we know as we look through time that every language undergoes change. So languages are changing all the time. An interesting change that happened, interesting for linguists, change that happened to English way back in the day was called the Great Vowel Shift. So this is something that happened to English vowels between approximately the years 1400 and 1600. So you may be aware of the consequences of this change if you've ever learned a different European language, or maybe just are a speaker of a different European language, because the sort of letters that are used for the alphabet for languages like German, French, or Spanish don't really line up with sort of the vowel sounds that we get in English. So we have this letter, which we call E in English, but when you see this in, say, Spanish or French, it's pronounced more like A, which is what we kind of think of as this letter here. But this letter, in turn, is like an ah sound in French or German or Spanish, that sort of thing. Turns out that all the letters in English spelling used to refer to the same vowel sounds as we use for French or Spanish or German or whatever. So this used to be an A in English too, but then from 1400 to 1600, somehow those vowels just started shifting around. We don't know exactly why that occurred, but they kind of all wound up in different spots. And that, back in the days of Geoffrey Chaucer in the 1300s, he would have sounded or spelled himself, I guess, more like a French speaker would have. But by the time of Shakespeare, those vowels had shifted to be in new spots in terms of the way we produce them. So something similar, believe it or not, is happening in the modern day and age. It's called the Great Lakes Vowel Shift. So again, this isn't happening across the board in the English world, but it is happening sort of mostly in the United States, south of the Great Lakes, in cities like Chicago and Cleveland and Milwaukee and so on and so forth. And Canadians on the other side of the Great Lakes are not doing the same thing. They're actually kind of moving their vowels in a different direction. Infer what you might from that. But this is what it sounds like when somebody from Chicago says the name B-O-B.
Bob.
And this is what it sounds like when certain Canadian speakers say that in Canadian English.
Bob.
So we often think of American English and Canadian English being fairly similar, at least maybe compared to like English. But these two speakers,
Bob. Bob.
I think sound pretty clearly different, right? There's an example, one guy from Calgary saying the same name,
Bob.
So that's kind of in between, or maybe
Bob.
a little more similar to that.
Bob.
Not quite the same. Anyways, language changes at all levels of structure, including the vowels, the sounds, the words we use to express things, so on and so forth. The interesting thing about this is that languages evolve in reliable ways. There's patterns there too. There's generalizations we can draw from how they have evolved over time. So we can kind of have an expectation of how they might change in the future, or we can use language as we see it now to kind of look back in time to see how it might have been different in the past. Through that, we can learn that languages are related to one another because we see similarities across different languages to sort of let us know that in the past they were maybe the same language and they kind of split off into different directions. So I mentioned this before, but like a language like German, English is historically related to German. If you go back far enough, of like 1,000 years, English was very similar to German. Then the French took over England and influenced English a lot, so English kind of became a little bit more like French, or at least used a lot of French words. French, however, is historically related to Spanish and Italian, so on and so forth, because those languages are all descended from the Latin language of the old Roman Empire, so on and so forth. And we can kind of figure this out and establish this using linguistics, historical linguistics. That's the part of the field that approaches this as a topic of study. But we can use this to say, well, we know how, say, French and Spanish descended from Latin. Maybe we can look at other languages which, we don't know for sure are related to one another and figure out, well, what was the sort of ancestor language of those languages? How did they sort of descend and differ from their original status, whatever, hundreds of thousands of years ago, in some written form that no longer exists or maybe never existed. We can figure that out using linguistics, and I'll give you an example here in a second. We also know that languages can die. This is another part of language change, is that eventually people can stop speaking a language and it will just go away, and if it hasn't been written down, then we'll never see it again or hear it again. We also know that new languages can be born, which is another kind of dramatic form of language change, but it does happen, and I'll give you an example of that. So I wanted to go back to this point just briefly. So there's kind of a classic moment in linguistics. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have the time to study historical linguistics in this particular semester. You can study it in 202 or in a 300 level class. But so I want to get this point in because it's kind of fun. But talked about Latin. Ancient Greek is another language which was kind of foundational to sort of the history of Western civilization, emerging in the Mediterranean about a couple thousand years ago. So Latin and Ancient Greek kind of were, by the time of like the 1700s, were still influential languages in the European world, and a lot of sort of academics and sort of the upper crust were supposed to study these languages because they were like, considered the august languages of the Roman past or something like that. So there's a story that there's a guy from England, William Jones, who had studied these languages, Latin and Greek, which were 2,000 years old to him, and knew them. And then this is part of when England was starting to get over into India and colonize that part of the world. He traveled to India in the late 1700s, and he got interested in the ancient languages of India. The most prominent one of which is called Sanskrit, and which we know the modern day languages of India are descended from, like Hindi and Bengali, Gujarati, and so on and so forth. So Sanskrit is more than 2,000 years old, and he started studying it, and then he noticed that it was actually quite similar to Latin and Greek. And he was the first guy to figure out, well, you know what, there's probably an older language which connects the two. So when we study Latin and Greek, we're not just studying European languages, or if you're studying Sanskrit, you're not just studying Indian languages, but they combine the two and they call them Indo-European languages. And so we still don't know exactly where the Indo-European languages were spoken, probably somewhere in between Europe and India, maybe like in the Turkey or Caucasus Mountains region, but they both had an ancestor which links those two cultures up from thousands of years ago in the past. And we didn't see that, we didn't know that until a linguist got on the scene and started figuring out what the connections were between these two groups of languages. And I'll give you another example, which comes from a more recent analysis, and it doesn't have anything to do with Europeans getting around the world, and instead it's about a connection between Polynesia and South America. So this is kind of cool. I only found out about this a couple years ago, and it's recently, like in the past 2 weeks, I've discovered that it's been confirmed by genetic analysis of these two groups of people. But you might know that the Polynesians were a famously seafaring civilization which went through all of the various different Pacific islands in the more eastern part of the Pacific and southern part here. And they kind of established societies in a gigantic triangle between Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island from about 2,000 years ago to like about the year 1200 or so. So this is kind of the last part of the world that human beings got to, and Polynesians were the ones who got there first. Nobody knows exactly how they were able to navigate all these waters with so much empty space in between the islands, but they did. And then it's recently been discovered they didn't just stop at Easter Island. They kept going, and they were able to get to South America. And the reason we know this is because of the linguistic evidence. So there are what they found in South America were sweet potatoes. I think being Canadians, we don't know how much Canadians love sweet potatoes, but this is where sweet potatoes originally came from, was South America, where they were called something like kumara. So there were no sweet potatoes in Polynesia, but they eventually came back, and the Polynesians brought the name with them. So this map shows you, well, the Spaniards, colonized Mexico, and the Portuguese colonized Brazil, and they had their own different words for sweet potato, like batata for the Portuguese, camote for the Spanish. But then there was a totally separate group of languages which had various forms of the word kumara. So it's called kumara, I guess, in Easter Island, kuma'a here in the Marquesas, uala in Hawaii, so on and so forth. These are all related to one another through hundreds of years of language change, and we can establish that through the study of historical linguistics. I'll also tell you a little bit about that other idea of language birth, that languages can be born, and this is also a story that involves Latin America, I guess you could say. So this is from Nicaragua. So prior to the 1970s, this is also an example of the limits of language as an innate faculty, I guess you could say. So prior to the 1970s, children who were born deaf in Nicaragua would largely grow up isolated and with minimal language input. So if their parents, had no system of communicating with them if they were deaf and couldn't understand what was being spoken, then they would basically learn a rough symbol or rough collection of signs to use to communicate with one another, but it was kind of limited. And it was just kind of a sad situation, really. But what happened at the end of the 1970s is that there was a socialist government that came to power. They're called the Sandinistas. The fact that socialists were in power in Nicaragua was a big political issue in the United States when I was growing up. It seems to have calmed down. But one of the things they did at the end of the 1970s, being socialists, they wanted to centralize things. So they started a central school for deaf children in the country. So they took these deaf children who had been growing up on individual farms just by themselves and with nobody to talk to or communicate with. And they brought them all to a centralized school to try to educate them as well as they could. And once those kids were brought together, they were all deaf and all kind of in the same boat. They started being creative with language. And eventually they developed a systematic form of communication, which is now known as Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is a language which had never been seen before the 1970s. And I'll just let you know, we're unfortunately not going to have time to study sign language in this class, but it's a perfectly valid topic of inquiry for a linguist to look at, because sign languages, it turns out, when you do focus on them and how they work, sign languages have similar structures to and all of the expressive power of spoken languages as well. So it's just a different kind of form of language because it's not spoken or acoustic, it's signed and visual instead. Yeah. So languages can be born, and we can dig back into the past to see what languages were like that we have no record of as well. What we're going to explore in this semester is the complex nature of human language from both biological and social perspectives. We're going to kind of get both the nurture and nature sides in here, and so far as we're able. We're going to look at this, though, from a scientific linguistic point of view. So we're going to kind of dig into the structure of language to kind of understand these influences on it. So we're going to try to answer the question, what is the knowledge of language? How is language used for communication? How do we know that language is uniquely human? We'll kind of talk about some of these big picture issues at the very start of the class in the first couple of weeks. How does human language differ from other animals' systems of communication so that we know that it's kind of has these biological features? How can language be creative? What are the universal properties of language? No matter where we go across the world, and no matter who we're talking to, there are some universal properties that those human beings will have in their languages. What are those? Okay, so to give you kind of a hint of the answers to that question, the majority of this class is going to be devoted to learning how to analyze and understand the structure of language. So this is beyond the first 2 or 3 weeks. We're going to look at, first of all, morphology, which is the study of word structure in language. So in morphology, we try to figure out what are the units of meaning in language and how are words formed in language. So when I say units of meaning, normally we think of words, but words themselves can be kind of broken down into smaller units. So like words is a word that has the word word in it and also has this little bit s in it, which makes it plural, so on and so forth. We can kind of break words down into smaller units of meaning. How do we break them down? How do we put them together to create meaningful words in language? The second sort of topic of study will be phonetics, which is our first crack at what I'm calling sound structure. So what sounds do we use in speech? How do we make those sounds? Like how do we move around our lips and jaws and tongues and so on and so forth to have sound come out of our mouths? And then what's the best way to write down what a person has actually said when they're speaking? That is definitely a useful skill. I use it every day of my life. But in order to do that, we're going to kind of have to use a specialized alphabet to be able to sort of represent what they say. Having learned that, we're going to move on to sort of a more abstract analysis of sound structure, which is called phonology. So this is not about sort of what's specifically going on when people speak, but rather what sort of relationships exist between the sounds that are used in language. What distinguishes one sound from another? Why do we think that some sounds are similar when they're different from others? And what rules do languages use to put sounds together into words? Like I showed you the example of there's possible words in English and there's unpossible words in English. Unpossible itself is an unpossible word. I should be saying impossible. It's just my sense of humor. Anyways, studying these rules can give you clues as to how languages put sounds together. Studying the rules of how languages put sounds together can kind of let you know why the possible words are possible and the impossible words are impossible. Right now, it's impossible for me to say words, so I'm going to get a drink of water and move on and say the next topic will be the study of sentence structure, which is called syntax. And when we look at that, we study how languages combine words into sentences. How do sentences relate to one another? Like I gave you the example of statements versus questions before. There's relationships between how you express those two types of sentences. Or how do the rules of word order differ from one language to another? For the most part in this class, we'll be focusing on English examples, but I'm definitely going to throw in a fair number of non-English examples because the rules that we're talking about are not just specific to English as we know it. They apply all across the board, all around the world. I am just primarily going to use English for some of the basic examples because I'm assuming that we all speak English in this class, no matter where we come from or what languages we might speak natively. It's for convenience's sake more than anything else. Also, we're going to study the structure of meaning, which is called semantics. So how do words relate to or represent the world? How do we know what words mean? And then how can we put words together to form sentences that mean something? So how do we know what a sentence means when we hear a new sentence that we've never heard before? And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about conversation structure. So that's called pragmatics. So when we get to pragmatics, rules are not called rules anymore because they can be broken, and instead they're called maxims. So what maxims do people follow in conversations? How can you violate those maxims and kind of get away with it? And when you do, how do people get meaning out of your violation of those maxims? How do you get meaning out of the context in which something is said? And then what do people read into what you say when you're sort of not being direct exactly with what you mean? That's called pragmatics. So in the future, after that rundown, normally I would pause to field questions, but like I said, it's awkward because I'm just talking to a computer screen right now. But next time we're going to discuss human language and animal communication and a little bit about language knowledge. There are a couple of readings for these topics that I will post to the course webpage, and I'll let you know about that when it happens. Again, I'm doing this a little bit ahead of time, but in September I'll be communicating more directly and more consistently with you. And then I also want to say, are there any questions? And you can ask those to me at any time through email or like in comments or what have you. But if anything has popped into your head, I'd be happy to hear about it because normally there's a lot more give and take with this lecture at the beginning of the semester. So yeah, send in your quick right answers as well. I want to know a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from. And if you do have thoughts about language that you want to express, or you have questions about language that you want to know more about, now's the time to ask. All right, so I'll see you next time.